was accepted in the year 1926 by the American Ophthalmological Society. The epidemiology. The incidence is rare. It is 1 in 15,000 to 1 in 18,000 live births. Still, it is the most common intraocular malignancy in children. There is no racial, sex, or eye predilection. It is mostly unilateral, and it is bilateral in about 25 to 35% of cases. The survival rates have improved remarkably from the year 1890s to now to the year 2000, and from about 5% at that time to about more than 95% now. The age at diagnosis in case of unilateral retinoblastomas is usually about 2 years, while for bilateral, the age at diagnosis is usually 1 year, and the average age of diagnosis is 1.5 years. A little bit about genetics of this particular tumor. Now, what happens in this tumor is there is a deletion of the 14 band or the long arm of the 13th chromosome, that is 13q14. The retinoblastoma gene is a tumor suppressor gene, and for retinoblastoma to occur, both the genes should be damaged. The intact gene protects against the formation of retinoblastoma. Of all the newly diagnosed cases, about 6% are familial and about 94% are sporadic. So bilateral cases are generally germline mutations, and they are hereditary. The unilateral cases are generally 85% of cases are non-hereditary, and only about 15% of cases are hereditary or have germline mutations. Knutson's 2-hit hypothesis is very famous, which he coined in the year 1971. He said that in hereditary retinoblastomas, the first hit is a germinal mutation, which affects all the cells, and the second hit is a somatic mutation. Hence, there is a predisposition to second non-ocular tumors like osteosarcoma in cases of hereditary retinoblastoma. In unilateral sporadic cases, both the hits are somatic mutations, and so there is no risk of second non-ocular tumors. Now, genetic counseling is very useful because genetic testing for the RB1 gene is not possible because of the expense involved. So we have empiric risks of recurrence which can be used for family members of patients, and we can arrive at a probability of the occurrence of retinoblastoma in the siblings or in the future offspring. So when we do genetic counseling, we can tell the patients that if there is a positive family history, 40% of the siblings and 40% of the offspring are at risk. If there is no family history and it is a unilateral retinoblastoma, 1% of the siblings and 8% of the offspring are at risk. If there is no family history and it is a bilateral retinoblastoma, 6% of the siblings and 40% of the offspring are at risk. Now, the most important part of this lecture is the clinical features. So the most common presentation is leukocoria or a white reflex, which is seen in 56% of the cases. Strabismus is also fairly common in about 20% of cases. Exotropia or divergent squint being more common than a convergent squint. In addition, presentation could be with a painful red eye with glaucoma, poor vision, sometimes orbital cellulitis, and sometimes presence of unilateral mydriasis, heterochromia, iridis, hyphema, nystagmus, failure to thrive, and white spots on the iris, and rarely they could be presenting asymptomatically. So when you look into the eye, we see these transparent white fluffy masses initially and a white reflex. And there are 3 patterns for this tumor. If the tumor grows into the vitreous cavity, it will fill the vitreous cavity and vitreous seeding will occur, which is called as an endophytic tumor. If the tumor, on the other hand, grows into the subretinal space, it is called as an exophytic tumor, and you can see the retinal vessels on the tumor surface, as in this case. And rarely we have the diffuse infiltrating type, which is a horizontal growth in the retina and which is the most difficult to detect. Advanced lesions can breach the lamina cribrosa and reach the optic nerve. It can present with extraocular extension into the orbit, and there could be distant metastasis to the brain, skull, bones, and the lymph nodes. A brief note about the pathology. When we look grossly, you can see these chalky white masses with foci of calcification. The endophytic tumor causes vitreous seeding, while the exophytic tumor causes retinal detachment. When you look at the low power features, you can see that it is having eosinophilic areas of necrosis and basophilic areas of tumor, and there are very deep basophilic areas of calcification. On microscopy, in poorly differentiated tumors, you see small round cells with large hyperchromatic nuclei and scanty cytoplasm with mitotic figures. But the well-differentiated tumors are the ones which show the classic rosettes and the florets. The flexner vitrecina rosettes are the ones which are arranged around the central lumen. The Homer-Wright rosettes are the ones which are arranged around a central neuromuscular tangle. And the pseudo-rosettes are the ones which are arranged around blood vessels. And the florets are the pear-shaped eosinophilic structures. So this is a Homer-Wright rosette, which is arranged around this neurovascular structures. And this is a flexive intestinal rosette, which is having these eosinophilic structures in the center. And these are the pseudo-rosettes, which are arranged around the blood vessels. So when we come to the diagnosis, we look at the history. So if there is a child who's less than 3 years and who presents with a white reflex or even squint or a red eye, always have a little bit of suspicion about this particular condition. More so if there is a family history. The clinical features are white reflex, squint or red eye, less commonly hyphema, glaucoma, rubiosis, phthisis bulbi. And if there are multiple pink or white tumors in one or both eyes in a child less than 5 years, it is most likely to be a retinoblastoma. Now, it's very important to detect the glow. So if the child, this is a flash photo of a child, and where the child is directly looking into the camera, and if you can see some kind of white reflex in one eye, then one should have a very high index of suspicion that there is a problem inside the eye, and most likely it is a retinoblastoma. So diagnosis is based on external ocular examination of the white reflex, presence of pseudohypopyon or hyphema. Examination under anesthesia is a must, where we want to have a dilated fundus examination. We want to do a bilateral fundus examination along with indentation. We always measure the intraocular pressure, look carefully at the anterior segment structures. And in over 90% of cases, this tumor can be diagnosed directly by indirect ophthalmoscopy. Ultrasonography has also got a role where the A scan will show high internal echoes and attenuation of the orbital pattern. But the B scan is one which clinches the diagnosis, because you see these high reflective echoes inside a mass lesion. And once you lower the gain, you still have these high echoes, which indicates that there is presence of calcification. The CT and the MRI are very useful to understand the presence of extraocular extension and the presence of intracranial extension, more so the MRI. There is a role of bone marrow biopsy and cerebrospinal fluid tap, because both these help us in understanding more about the spread or the metastasis of this particular tumor. Classification is important because we want to optimize the management of these cases. The Rees-Elsworth was in the era of radiotherapy and it is no longer in vogue. The SN classification is also no longer being used. What we now use is the international grouping classification, which is based on the extent of the disease, dissemination of the intraocular tumor, the natural history, and the probability of salvaging the eye. The most important feature here is the extent of intraocular tumor dissemination. So in group A, these are the small round tumors, which you can see here, which are away from the fovea and the optic disc, which are small, less than 3 millimeters in diameter. And the group B tumors are the ones which are larger tumors, but there is no tumor dissemination into the vitreous cavity or diffusely elsewhere. So there is no vitreous seeding in these cases. The group C includes the tumors which have got local tumor dissemination. So it has spread beyond the confines of the tumor. And the group D are the ones which are the worst cases, which have diffuse tumor dissemination. And the group E are the unsalvageable eyes. So this group E includes cases like neovascular glaucoma, massive intraocular hemorrhage, blood-stained corneas, presence of massive tumor necrosis, orbital cellulitis or phthisis, tumor which is in the anterior segment or tumor touching the lens, or a diffuse infiltrating retinoblastoma. So this picture kind of gives you the essence of the international intraocular retinoblastoma classification. So the group A are small tumors which are restricted. The group B are larger tumors, but both these are confined to the retina. The group C and the group D have escaped from the retina. There could be local vitreous seeding, or there could be presence of subretinal fluid, or the group D could be diffuse vitreous seeding with presence of more amounts of subretinal fluid. So in group C and D, the tumor is no longer confined to the retina. It has invaded the adjacent tissue, that is the vitreous and the subretinal space. And the group E tumors are the ones which are unsalvageable, which are the dangerous ones. So our success of treatment is much, much better in the group A, B, and the C groups. And group D and E are also doing well now with newer multimodal therapy, but they are the ones which are difficult to treat. The staging system tells us how much the disease has spread in the body. So stage 0 is an intraocular tumor only. Stage 1 is a tumor which has been where the eye has been enucleated and the tumor has completely been removed. Stage 2 is a tumor where there is residual orbital tumor, which means after enucleation, in the optic nerve stump, there is a little bit of tumor which has been left. So these ones are the ones which need especially extra care and extra treatment. The group 3 is a regional spread of the tumor where it is extending group substage A into the orbit, or substage B where it's entering the preauricular or the cervical lymph nodes. And the group 4 are the metastatic disease, which could be substage A, hematogenous metastasis, and substage B, CNS disease. So staging system also tells us about what kind of systemic therapy we need to give to the patient. So in a sense, the take-home message from this talk is that we must be able to detect retinoblastomas when we routinely see children in our clinic. So what are the red flags? So what should alert your suspicion? One is the presence of a white reflex. Second, any child who's present with a squint, it's always a good idea to dilate and see the fundus. I've had at least 2 or 3 cases in my practice where the patient actually came to me for squint. And when I dilated, I could see a tumor inside the eye, which is very scary. And sometimes patients are present with unexplained hyphema following some kind of trivial trauma, which you cannot explain, or they could be hypopion, or they could be a red eye with glaucoma, or orbital cellulitis, which you're not able to explain clearly, or unexplained phthisis. So in all these cases, it is very important to have a high index of suspicion, dilate when necessary, if required, perform a B scan or a imaging by MRI scan, and always follow these patients. So I want to thank you for your kind attention. Also remember not to forget about the flash photograph, which is a very useful way of detecting retinoblastoma. If the parents feel that the child has some problem, if they're unable to come, the least they can do is take a good flash photograph where the child is looking into the camera of the mobile, and they can send it to you, and you can look at that and assess whether the child has got any kind of eye problems. So in these COVID times, I'd like to end by saying that you are braver than you believe, and stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. So I want all of you, to my colleagues and my friends in POS, Ophthalmological Society, and all my colleagues all over, to stay strong and make all the people wonder how you are still smiling. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh, for a very exhaustive review and yet very simple review of the entire retinoblastoma. Any questions at this stage for Dr. Ramesh?
Sir, I have a question. I'm Dr. Ashutosh.
Yeah, Dr. Ashutosh, please go ahead.
Sir, actually, like we said, for investigations like MRI and CT scan, both can be used for extraocular spread. So, do we prefer MRI over CT scan? Because of the fact that
Yeah, definitely.
those
Yeah.
with RBL mutation, we can have more radiation exposure in CT scan.
Yeah, we definitely prefer MRI because for 2 reasons. One is we don't want to subject the child to a lot of radiation. And
Okay.
secondly, MRI gives us more information about spread in the soft tissues, especially the brain and the optic nerve.
So I have a question for you myself. When you mentioned UHE B scan, and it's a common practice that you refer all these patients to a radiologist who would be performing the UHE B scan for you. So any special instructions that you want to give to the radiologist, any particular pointers that you want to specifically want your radiologist to look at?
Yeah. So what I do is I always mention that we are suspecting retinoblastoma. So look specifically for an intraocular mass. Secondly, lower the gain to about 70 decibels. And please look for the presence of intraocular calcification. So they have to lower the gain and tell us whether there is high spikes. And so we can be more clear about the fact whether there is any presence of calcification. So I specifically write this every time I send the prescription to the radiologist.
So I have a question.
Yes.
From Dr. Vishali. I'm a VR consultant currently in Chittagong.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to ask, how often do you counsel for genetic counseling? Because I always feel that the test is around, I guess, 25,000, and it is a one-time test, so it avoids unnecessary UAs and the cost of coming to the hospital and for the health risk. So I always feel that we don't convince the patient enough for genetic testing.
I think in a metro city, it's pretty easy to convince the patient, but maybe in a smaller place, it may be difficult. So we have 2 ways of doing it. One is to advise them for genetic counseling. And in Mangeshkar Hospital, we have a full-fledged genetic department who helps us. And the second thing which I showed you was the empirical risks. So you can tell them that these are the risks in the offspring, in the siblings. So if they are going to have a second child and the first child is already having retinoblastoma, I can always tell them that these are the risks. So they understand what is happening. Yes.
Okay, so but
Can I chime in, sir?
Yes, yes. Yes, please, Sonal.
Yeah. Taking on the same question about genetic counseling, I do agree with you, Dr. Vishali, about advising most of the patient about getting genetic counseling, especially in the children who have bilateral tumors and do show hereditary component in the form of family history. However, that doesn't exclude the need to get routine examinations. Even child, a second child of a priorly affected bilateral retinoblastoma, what we are going to come out with even after genetic counseling is a percentage chance that the child might be affected. So depending upon that, you might have to screen the child earlier. So I have actually screened a child within 15 days of birth and found, and that was a sibling of a bilaterally affected child, and found that child to have a unilateral tumor. So this actually prepares the parents for the journey ahead, and gives that will just provide them with a percentage chance to know how for the second child. However, the emphasis on screening and examination has to be given at all point of times.
Thank you. Ma'am, I would like to add something more. Like, if can you hear me now? Yeah. So, if a child has been treated, say at around 9 or 10 months, a tumor has been treated in an eye. So now, if we, so now we have diagnosed the child as retinoblastoma, as having retinoblastoma. So, at this stage, if a genetic counselor is advised and the child turns
Sorry, your
out to be,
window froze. Can you reframe the question?
just yeah, I just turned off now. So I review. I was asking that 9 month old child.
Yeah.
So if I have treated the child prior, and so now I know that the child has retinoblastoma. So at this stage, if I refer the child for genetic testing, and he turns out to be negative for the familial form. So now I don't need to continue, examining him so often for multiple tumors. I mean, for the other eye or uh,
No, even if he doesn't have a hereditary component, sporadic patients can also present bilaterally, or even that the single eye which was affected may recur and or show a new tumor occurrence. So these children are not completely out of risk. The risk goes on decreasing beyond 3 years of age. However, it still continues till around 8 to 9 years of age. So after that, you can make it an annual examination if you found that there are no more recurrences or the eye has been stable. But till they reach around 9 years of age, a regular follow-up schedule is very, very important. So apart from the age at their presentation, as well as during treatment, what we can go for is the tumor stability. So as long as the tumor stays stable, then you can go on increasing the interval between your follow-ups, initially 6 weeks to 8 weeks, then 12 weeks, 16 weeks, and so on and so forth. And then till 9 years of age, the child has to be examined twice yearly at least, even if it's completely regressed, or similar for unilateral or bilateral. Later than that, the examination can limit to an annual examination by the time the children are pretty grown up and they can uh, cooperate for an OPD evaluation.
I also advise the parents and any siblings to be screened with a
Right.
dilated fundus examination, because many
Yes,
times
very
you will
important.
find regressed retinoblastomas, retinocytomas, or there's a small risk that the sibling may also have a tumor. So it's always a good idea to screen the entire family to understand whether it is actually a sporadic case or it is a hereditary case.
Right.
then
Very
if
good.
the genetic counseling comes out to be either positive or negative, you do not vary the frequency of the EOS based on the report. So how do we convince? So how do we convince the parents? So I mean, what do we tell them? What is the use of genetic testing?
Genetic counseling, like I said, genetic counseling will give you an idea about, for example, if a couple having their first child affected, and on whatever their pedigree is, if it is a hereditary or non-hereditary, with genetic counseling and with genome mapping, what they will understand is the risk that the next child um the percentage risk that the next child might have retinoblastoma. So this will the detailed counseling helps them taking the decision to go ahead and take a chance for a second child, and if at all, and then knowing the percentage chance that the child might be affected, and so mentally prepare them as well.
Okay, ma'am.
Dr. Nikhil? Dr. Nikhil here?
Dr. Mukesh, can we proceed to the next talk,
we can
please?
proceed to the next talk. Dr. Sonal, can you start sharing your screen, and you can start the presentation, please? Yes, your screen is visible. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, you're audible, please.
Yeah.
Carry on.
All right.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, POS, for having me here. And after the very interesting and short but comprehensive overview of retinoblastoma by Dr. Murthy, sir, I would take it ahead and talk about managing retinoblastoma in today's era.
Please go ahead.
All right. So whenever we talk, so this is a slide actually as a generalized goals for treatment of any cancer. The primary goal always remains the life salvage of the patient. Secondary goal remaining being the organ salvage, or for in our case eye salvage, and a tertiary goal is function salvage, or that is vision salvage for us. So always remember this sequence for setting our own priorities. This will come into account later. All right. So treatment of retinoblastoma has evolved exhaustively over the last few years. It started with pure enucleation and radiation in 1950s when the Rees-Elsworth classification came out. In 1990s, saw the progress with systemic or intravenous chemotherapy, along with adjuvant focal therapies like photocoagulation lasers, thermotherapy, and cryotherapy. Periocular chemotherapy was introduced in around 1995 for treatment of vitreous seeds, and leading to the latest development called selective intraarterial chemotherapy a couple of decades back, that is around 2003. So when talking about management of retinoblastoma, it's a integrated efforts of multidisciplinary management involving an ocular oncologist, a pediatric medical oncologist, ocular pathologist, a radiation oncologist, a geneticist, as well as social worker dealing with other social issues of the family. So what does the decision, or we will go on to see the plethora of modalities now available. So treatment of each child is customized using a permutation combination of different methods to suit that particular child's needs. So how are the needs decided? These are depending upon the factors below, like age at presentation, laterality, either one eye or both eyes affected, location of the tumors, staging of the tumors as we saw in the presentation by Dr. Murthy, a projected visual prognosis, systemic condition of the child, for example, any associated comorbidities, familiar socioeconomic status, because as we'll go on to see, retinoblastoma management is a chronic process, taking months to years. So this is also an important factor in overall prognosis of the child and cost effectiveness. So keeping these in mind, pardon me. So treatment modalities available include systemic or chemotherapy, focal treatments, and local treatment. We'll go on and see a little bit in detail about each of these. So when we saw the grouping of international classification of retinoblastoma, okay, all right, so. Okay. So talking about group A, these are small tumors less than 3 millimeter in diameter. So when they are present in the non-critical area, only focal therapies like thermotherapy or cryotherapy for anterior tumors work well. But when they are present in the visually critical area, that is near fovea or juxtapapillary, a chemoreduction with the help of either intraarterial or intravenous chemotherapy is applied. Similarly, for group B tumors, which are a little bit larger, more than 3 millimeter in diameter or present in visually critical areas. For group C tumors, where local vitreous seeds or subretinal seeds or subretinal fluid is present, chemoreduction with the help of intraarterial or intravenous chemotherapy followed by focal therapy is the norm. Group D tumors are the one having diffuse characteristics, diffuse vitreous seeds, diffuse subretinal fluid. Again, in here, chemoreduction along with intravitreal chemotherapy or periocular chemotherapy for vitreous seeds remains an option. Enucleation for unilateral group D eye is still a viable option. Group E eyes are the eyes with extensive tumor, and along with clinical risk factors present, as seen in the picture here, there are some anterior chamber vitreous seeds seen here, and the eye is full of tumor as well as vitreous destined seeds. So chemoreduction along with intravitreal or periocular seeds is an option. Enucleation is still a viable option for such eyes too. So all of this right now, what I'm talking about is about intraocular retinoblastoma. We'll have a small note on orbital tumors later on. So this is when you're talking about the eye individually unilateral tumors. So when you're seeing the patient as affected bilaterally, if both eyes have asymmetric tumors, group A to group E, initial start with systemic chemotherapy followed by focal measures as required. If there is a lot of asymmetry, that is one eye having group A to C and the other with extensive tumor, the other eye may have an option to get enucleated, and the rest of the therapy can continue for the better eye. Now let's look into detail each of these modality. Chemotherapy now is divided into two parts: intravenous or systemic chemotherapy and intraarterial chemotherapy. Intravenous chemotherapy has been in use since 4 to 5 decades, and the drugs described or used are vincristine, etoposide, and carboplatin. It's always a 2-day regimen. The dose depends upon the indications, either standard dose or a high dose standard or a high dose regimen. Dr. Tushar will later on throw a little bit light on both of these regimens. The chemotherapy has to be repeated every 3 or 4 weekly for empirical number of 6 cycles. The number of cycles might increase depending upon residual tumor or recurrent tumor. The side effects or complications of systemic chemotherapy include bone marrow suppression leading to neutropenia and immunocompromised status. Because of experiencing years of complications of intravenous chemotherapies, physicians were active to find out an alternate for this. Thus came intraarterial chemopherapy. So with the name, intraarterial chemotherapy is a selective form of chemotherapy where the chemotherapeutic agents are directly instilled into the ostium of ophthalmic artery under fluoroscopic guidance under general anesthesia. Like here in the picture, the child is anesthetized under fluoroscopic guidance. The femoral vein is catheterized, and a microcatheter is inserted, and angiography is carried out to know the opening of the ostium of the superior ophthalmic artery. And the superior ophthalmic artery is then selectively cannulated, meaning the ostium is slightly entered into the ostium of the ophthalmic artery, and then the drugs are instilled. So reaching to its highest concentration in the intraocular cavity instantly, avoiding systemic complications or systemic drug exposure. So this is the intraarterial chemotherapy protocol given by Shields et al. Group. So this is the protocol given for 3 drugs chemotherapy. Single drug, 2 drug, or all the 3 drug chemotherapy is also under use. So here for intraarterial chemotherapy, against what we did in systemic chemotherapy, the dose depends upon the age, not exactly the weight of the child. However, complications of intraarterial chemotherapy are still there. It's an expensive procedure. It has a steeper learning curve. It requires a cath lab setup, also requires highly trained neuro intervention radiologists to perform the procedure. Vascular complications, for example, branch retinal vein occlusion or vitreous hemorrhage are a possibility after ophthalmic artery instillation of the drugs, or even intracranial vascular unfortunate incidents like infarction or hemorrhage are also a possibility. Moving on to focal treatment, intravitreal chemotherapy. So vitreous seeds are actually pockets of cells of retinoblastoma suspended in the avascular vitreous. So naturally, either of the intravenous or intraarterial chemotherapy is not able to reach these avascular pockets in the vitreous. So intravitreal chemotherapy was introduced to treat these pockets or vitreous seeds. Vitreous seeds were classified by Dr. Munier into 3 types: vitreous cloud, dust, and spheres. So we can use intravitreal melphalan or topotecan to inject into the eye. So any intraocular procedure is actually contraindicated for retinoblastoma. However, the safety enhanced technique given by guidelines and given by guidelines by Dr. Munier give us a good method to avoid extraocular spread. There is a small video showing the procedure of intravitreal injection. So you use a 30 gauge needle, measure the distance from the limbus to the planned incision, planned injection site, mostly 2.5 millimeter away from pars plana in a phakic eye. Also, the quadrant to be injected is decided upon by absence of any retinal tumor in that quadrant, as well as the quadrant chosen is always opposite of the quadrant where the density of the vitreous seeds lie. So there shouldn't be any active tumor, there shouldn't be active vitreous seeds pocket exactly in the same quadrant, or presence of subretinal fluid in the same quadrant. So carefully chosen quadrant and careful measurement. Then the needle is injected transconjunctivally pars plana. The drug is slowly injected. A cryoprobe is applied to the needle, and the first ball is formed, and the needle is then gently taken out. This is a very important step into safety enhancement method of intravitreal injection. See the needle, how it slowly comes out from the frozen bed. Then proceed for completion of triple Fies-Throck cryotherapy. So cryotherapy over here helps in sealing the needle track, avoiding the regurgitation of injection from the needle track, as well as avoiding any accidental vitreous seeding into the needle track. So melphalan and topotecan are the drugs which can be used for intravitreal chemotherapy, can be used individually or combined. Out of these, topotecan is shown to have lesser complications and retinal toxicity compared to melphalan. Periocular chemotherapy is with carboplatin has been described even earlier than intravitreal, was invented to treat diffuse retinal seeds along with intravenous chemotherapy. However, carboplatin saw injections with carboplatin saw a lot of eyes getting extensively fibrosed or scarred. So again, topotecan was tried as periocular injection and has shown good results. So periocular topotecan can be used concurrently with intravenous chemotherapy. As against intravitreals, we generally wait till finishing of a total consolidation with intravenous chemotherapy to start with intravitreal injection to treat the residual vitreous seeds. Going on to further focal treatments, transpupillary thermotherapy is a good modality. It uses infrared radiation via semiconductor diode laser of 810 nanometer. It basically heats the tumor up to the temperature of 40 to 60 degrees. It's just subthermal. It does not char, just enough to cause cellular damage. The spot size used is 1300 micron with duration of 9000 milliseconds. So the color change, the slight color change or blanching is appreciated. And here you put give the spots exactly onto the tumor surface, as opposed to what we do in laser photocoagulation. You do not put the spots around the tumor, you do the spots onto the tumor. Modifications like ICG or indocyanine green enhanced thermotherapy can also be used to use their synergistic effect to our benefit. Thermotherapy and chemotherapy have been shown synergistic effects too. So after a consolidation of tumor, after initial 3 cycles of chemotherapy, we generally tend to start transopulary thermotherapy with the 4th cycle of chemotherapy concurrently. Cryotherapy is another local modality. So cryotherapy uses a low temperature, like seen over here. When you indent the eyeball or indent the tumor in question and give a cycle, apply cryotherapy, that will give you an ice ball formation involving the tumor. And sometimes if you have some focal vitreous seeds over here, can also be involved in the ice ball, followed by the thaw. So triple freeze thaw cryotherapy works well for anterior tumors, which can be reached during during the EUA as well. So the damage in cryotherapy occurs mainly during thawing due to cellular damage and cellular apoptosis. So these are some of the examples. So this is a large group D tumor, which was treated with 3 cycles of intraarterial chemotherapy and along with focal thermotherapy. This is a type of regression with complete calcification. This is another child showing a group E at presentation here, actually showing an endophytic tumor with complete retinal detachment and SRF. This was a regressed picture. Again, another group D tumor. In a process of regression, there is some active tumor over here again, which can be treated with focal measures like TTT. Another tumor presenting endophytic tumor along with multiple vitreous seeds, treated with chemotherapy and intravitreal chemotherapy, showing good regression and disappearance of the vitreous seeds. Now coming to enucleation. So maximum efforts are always made to salvage the eye, even the group D and group E eyes, which are called as unsalvageable. However, in case of recurrent tumors or treatment resistant tumors, enucleation is still a viable option. For a unilateral advanced tumor where the child cannot repeatedly follow up for chemotherapy or repeated examination, enucleation is still a viable option. So there are some basic instructions when you do an enucleation for retinoblastoma eye. Myoconjunctival technique is recommended. You have to do minimal manipulation, avoid perforation of the eye at any cost, because what that will do is cause an accidental orbital retinoblastoma initiation. The optic nerve stump should be aimed long, at least 15 millimeter. Inspect the enucleated eye for macroscopic extraocular lesions and optic nerve involvement. Harvest the fresh tissue for genetic studies if possible. We can always replace the orbital volume with the help of a primary implant. We avoid biointegrated implants in cases where postoperative radiotherapy might be indicated. So here is a small video about technique of enucleation. So you start with 360-degree peritomy. Try to conserve maximum amount of conjunctiva over here. See how the scissor rests onto the cornea and preserves maximum amount of conjunctiva. That is then followed by tagging of individual recti muscle, horizontal as well as vertical. So you double tag them. First tag is 4O silk and the second tag with a 6O vicryl. The muscle is then transected in between the two ties. This is the method followed for each and every recti. Then the obliques are also transected. Then you prolapse the eyeball from the socket with the help of these stay sutures you have taken priorly. Hold the 6O suture now taken at the lateral rectus and introduce your enucleation scissor in between the lateral rectus and the globe to reach intraconally and aim for a larger amount of optic nerve stump. You gently introduce the scissors, strum the optic nerve, free the optic nerve of its attachments and fibrous tissue, and then that cut it. And the next step, the PMMA implant is put into the in the posterior Tenon's space, and 3-layer closure is done: posterior Tenon's followed by anterior Tenon's. Each recti muscle is then sutured to the respective fornix to help gain the motility to the implant. A last layer of conjunctival closure, and the appropriate sized conformer is then placed, and suture tarsorrhaphy is carried out for better cosmetic results. For such eyes, after completion of their systemic treatment, can be fitted with custom ocular prosthesis. Immediately after removal of the eyeball, the removed eyeball has to be examined to check the length of the optic nerve. Any dilated episcleral veins present have to be marked, and the pathologist has to be communicated regarding the markings, because these might be the area of potential choroidal invasion. So they have to take their calotte cuts from the marked areas to look for any choroidal invasion. So this is the cosmetic result after fitting of a customized ocular prosthesis. So this was a child with a right eye enucleated and fitting with a COP in 6 weeks. This was a child presenting at 2 weeks of age, starting with a sterile orbital inflammation in the left eye and a group A tumor in the right eye. After neoadjuvant chemotherapy, her left eye went into phthisis with stable regression in the right eye on focal treatment. And then after fitting of custom ocular prosthesis, this is her appearance today. Talking about histopathology, as Dr. Murthy rightly have shown you the differentiating features of retinoblastoma, I would mainly focus on the examination details over here. So any evidence of extraocular tumor nodules or thickened optic nerve has to be noticed. The thickened optic nerve can be diagnosed with looking at the pliability of the nerve. A stiff nerve attached to the eye globe, it's suggestive of optic nerve invasion. A pliable optic nerve is suggestive of normal optic nerve. Then measure rest of the dimensions. Internal examination has to be done to examine the tumor and possible areas of necrosis, tumor differentiation, and high-risk features. So what are the histopathology high-risk features? So these are the terminologies which the pathologist will report if at all present. Presence of anterior chamber seeding, like we saw in the picture of group EI, iris or anterior chamber in segment infiltration with iris infiltration or ciliary body involvement. Massive choroidal invasion of more than 3 millimeter, a retrolaminar optic nerve invasion of optic nerve to its transection head, scleral infiltration or extrascleral extension. Why do we need to know about histopathological risk factors? Is this paves your way to start the adjuvant therapy post enucleation. So the criteria for starting of adjuvant standard dose adjuvant chemotherapy are anterior segment invasion, iris or ciliary body invasion, a massive choroidal invasion, retrolaminar optic nerve invasion, a combination of optic nerve infiltration and choroidal infiltration of any thickness. High dose adjuvant chemotherapy is needed when sclera is involved, so full thickness scleral invasion or extrascleral extension, or optic nerve invasion at the transection. High dose chemotherapy has to be started for 12 cycles. Adjuvant radiotherapy is also indicated in same 3 indications for high dose chemotherapy above. Talking about radiotherapy, the local radiotherapy is a plaque brachytherapy. So plaques are essentially episcleral episcleral radiation devices. So this is a ruthenium-106 plaque. So ruthenium is mounted on a silver body, and that is how the plaque is made. So after localizing the tumor, specifically indicated in cases of residual or recurrent tumors, fortunately retinoblastoma being a round cell tumor is very radiosensitive. So radiotherapy is quite an important modality of treatment. So plaque is placed on at a measured location as indicated, and it has to be left in situ for a measured amount of duration. The dosimetry is provided by a radiation physicist depending upon the decay rate of the plaque and the time available. and then the plaque is left in situ and removed after given duration of time. Generally 6 to 8 weeks later, the regression or the effects of the plaque brachytherapy are visible. Other radiation technology is external beam radiotherapy. External beam radiotherapy has been there since the history of retinoblastoma. However, nowadays with improved technologies like stereotactic radiation or intensity modulated radiation, the collateral damage that we used to see with external beam radiation in the past has been minimized to quite a certain extent. Talking a little bit about orbital retinoblastoma. So all of the modalities we just saw are for intraocular retinoblastoma, but advanced stages of extraocular retinoblastoma can also be seen on these are the orbital retinoblastomas, can be primary, secondary, accidental, overt, or microscopic. So the treatment involves metastatic analysis followed by chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation. The surgery is generally sandwiched in between two halves of chemotherapy. And surgery and radiation is sandwiched in between the two halves of chemotherapy. So this is the protocol provided for orbital tumors by Dr. Honavar in his review. Again, it does show a neoadjuvant chemotherapy, decision about the type of surgery, enucleation or exenteration, depending upon the extent of orbital tumor, residual after the initial neoadjuvant chemotherapy, external beam radiation, followed by completion of chemotherapy. So,
Dr. Sonal, sorry to interrupt. We are running a little short of time.
Yes,
so
I need a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So, all right. So with intraocular, with the modalities available for intraocular tumors, so we have achieved tumor control of 100% for group A to C tumors. D and E still see 75 to 80% of survival rate. For orbital tumors, the mortality can vary between 25 to 75%, but that's why the early detection and appropriate treatment stands more important. So metastatic retinoblastoma forms remaining 5% of the disease, needs more of palliative chemotherapy and radiation. Thank you, POS, for this opportunity. I enjoyed the talk immensely. I acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Honavar, and my parent institute, Center for Sight Hospital. And thank you for the patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sonal. It was an excellent talk, very well explained. Dr. Mukesh, is Dr. Nikhil there?
Yeah, Dr. Nikhil.
I'm very much there.
Yeah. Please carry on.
Yeah. So I think before moving on to Dr. Shah's talk, I would just like to cover, because of the power outage, we had to change the sequence a little. So we'll just go over the differential diagnosis in retinoblastoma, and it's just going to take 1 minute. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yeah. So just going over the differential diagnosis in retinoblastoma, we have few common pathologies, the retinoblastoma being the primary pathology. The congenital cataract is relatively easy to diagnose. You would have bluish hue in the pupillary area, and you would have fairly normal ultrasound. The retinopathy of prematurity, again, you would have a concrete history of prematurity, concrete history of comorbidities, oxygen supplementation in ICU stay, and so on. And you would find fibrovascular membranes and abnormally dilated tortuous blood vessel with some amount of retinal traction in the anterior vitreous. The chief other pathologies which I wanted to go over was Coats disease. This is typically classically a unilateral male in the first decade. This is the essentially clinical diagnosis. You would find lots of telangiectatic vessels, which, unlike in retinoblastoma, would be variably tortuous, in the sense you would have these light bulbs, you would have these microaneurysms, and you would have lots of subretinal fluid, intraretinal fluid, and subretinal and intraretinal lipid exudation. So this would be the classical clinical picture of Coats disease. You would have another common differential in the form of persistent fetal vasculature. So this is the vasculature which is supposed to nourish the lens during the intraocular development, and you would find lots of fibrovascular membranes with some drag on the ciliary processes. So you would find cataractous lens, retrolateral membrane, so which is exactly opposite to that of retinoblastoma, where you absolutely have a clear lens. So is the case with ROP, but here you would get a cataractous lens with some ciliary diffraction. And typically these are unilateral cases, and these are small deformed globes. You have microcornea, shallow AC, and at times retinal deformities as well. And a toxocariasis where you get a PET exposure history, and the cases which commonly get confused with retinoblastoma are the ones where it's a unilateral presentation, and you have a central granuloma, which is a whitish elevated mass with overlying vitritis. On ultrasound, you might find a peripheral granuloma also, and you might get a fibrous stump which is going from the disc to the peripheral region. Typically, there is no calcification. So this is something which separates it from the retinoblastoma. So these were just few common entities. I'm aware that this list is by no means exhaustive, but I think for the want of time, I think these are the highlighting differential diagnosis which I have at mind. I think we can take the questions later if at all there are any on this point. But I think I would like to invite our guest speaker, Dr. Tushar Patil, the medical hemato-oncologist, to speak on the chemotherapeutic regimes and his role in the team management of retinoblastoma.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are.
Yeah.
Dr. Nikhil, you'll have to stop sharing screen and then.
Yeah, I'll just do that. Yeah.
So actually, Dr. Nikhil, you can continue with that. I don't have a presentation to make. I'll have few words. Yeah. So first of all, I would like to say that the ocular oncosurgeon plays the most important vital role in deciding the sequence of the treatment as far as the chemotherapy is concerned. So as we can see from the staging perspective also, the intraocular treatments, the neoadjuvant chemotherapy, the adjuvant chemotherapy, the palliative chemotherapy, all that is probably a communication between the ocular oncologist and the medical oncologist, but primarily ocular oncosurgeons are the ones who would take a call on this. And the one thing which I would like to point out is adjuvant chemotherapy is definitely in all high-risk diseases, as madam has already mentioned, and very high-risk diseases will go for a high-risk chemotherapy pattern where we would like to use the dosages, and probably few of the dosages are double dose of maybe carboplatin or higher doses of etoposide. 6 cycles is the standard, but yes, it's always variable. Sometimes we want a more response to happen, probably we extend few of these cycles. The most important point here to make is that for all children who are less than 3 years of age, probably weight is the most important benchmark than the body surface area. So body surface area may not be very accurate. So we weight the dosages based on the weight of this child, not on the body surface area. Second is the treatment decisions are also what we say as made as far as what previous chemotherapy responses have been and what have been the previous toxicities. So if the patient has had multiple chemotherapies in the past, yes, neutropenia, cytopenias are quite common. If the patient has had any radiation in the past, especially if palliative radiation to the bones has taken place someplace or something, yes, then again cytopenias are quite common to occur. We are also worried not just about the cytopenias, but in the long run, the chances of second malignancies, especially the drug etoposide, which is known to cause have a cumulative effect in development of second malignancies. And most of these malignancies are hematological malignancies. Etoposide at a particular dosages or crossing those dosages is associated with the development of acute myeloid leukemias, and hence we are worried about these, especially for recurrent diseases where we plan our chemotherapies. The treatment protocol essentially evolves around 3 drugs: vincristine, etoposide, and carboplatin, given in a particular sequence and a particular dosages depending on these clinical scenarios that we see. Sometimes in the relapsed recurrent setting, we are using a combination of vincristine and topotecan also. And in few of our cases and few of the institutes are also following protocols which are used usually for other round cell tumors, maybe drugs like ifosfamide, carboplatin, etoposide combinations, or ifosfamide, cisplatin, etoposide combinations. So this chemotherapy, probably the dosages and everything is beyond the scope of this discussion. What I would like to point out here is, yes, chemotherapy makes a tremendous difference as far as the outcomes are concerned. These tumors are highly sensitive to chemo radiation, and the local treatments probably becomes much more effective if at all chemo is required in the neoadjuvant setting. Even in the adjuvant setting, once our local treatment has happened, probably it helps decreasing the recurrence rates and improving the survival for these patients. So that's the essence of the talk. Thank you. If there are any questions, they can be actually taken up.
Intra-arterial chemotherapy also is available with us in Pune.
Yes, the Nanath Mangeshkar Hospital does carry out intra-arterial chemotherapy. So actually, apart from the ocular oncologist and or ophthalmologist, like I said, neurointerventional radiologist is another member in the team which is required for intra-arterial chemotherapy with a setup of a cath lab. So yeah.
And also, you said about plaque therapy, brachytherapy. Is it available with us in Pune?
No, not right now, but
Yeah.
I am on track of acquiring it maybe soon.
Okay. Ramesh is unmute.
Dr. Tushar,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, I have just read about you, and are you into some clinical trials with some new drugs, and that is an integrated system, something with non-allopathic drugs or something?
Yes, madam. We are doing those trials. We have a center called as Integrated Cancer Treatment Center at Wagholi, where we are trying to combine allopathy and Ayurveda, a systematic approach of Ayurveda along with allopathy for a select population of patients. Presently, we are doing trials in breast cancer patients and head and neck cancer patients. One set of patients, it's a Tata Memorial Hospital funded trial. 100 patients are receiving only chemotherapy and radiation as per the recommendations, and 100 patients are receiving adjuvant Ayurvedic treatment also along with the standard treatment. So there is a standard arm of chemotherapy and there is another arm of chemotherapy plus Ayurvedic treatment. At a finite number of cycles, the chemotherapy stops, after which the Ayurvedic treatment is all continued for almost 3 years. We are trying to evaluate in terms of toxicities, how can we best decrease the toxicities when we are giving chemotherapy by using Ayurvedic treatment. Second, we are evaluating inflammatory markers in the body and trying to see if these inflammatory markers are decreased by the use of Ayurvedic treatment in a systematic manner. Third, we are seeing if quality of life and survival, both of them are improved in such patients. So this is, the trial has stopped recruitment. We have already recruited all the patients. There is a follow-up going on now, and the results probably will be out in next 1 year or so. Till now, we have got encouraging results as far as inflammatory markers and quality of life is concerned. This survival data will be available by the end of next year. But presently, it is only restricted to breast cancer patients and head and neck cancer patients.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Murthy sir, you were saying something?
So what I was saying is that in Pune now we have a lot of all the modalities available. Nearly everything is available. We've got very good oncologists like Dr. Tushar Patil and his colleagues. We've got very good centers. We have very good friends like Sonal, and we all collaborate all the time. Except for plaque brachytherapy, we have everything available in Pune. And hopefully plaque brachytherapy is now being made by BARC at a much cheaper rate. So you'll be able to get it even more easier now. Once this lockdown and COVID times are over, we'll be in a much better position. And we can become a single city where everything can be done. We don't have to refer all the patients outside all the time.
So just for knowledge, how expensive is the chemotherapy?
No, I don't think it's expensive. The drugs are pretty cheap. The hospital setting and the other charges do matter, but yes, they're not extremely or exorbitant. It's pretty cheap otherwise. The drugs have been in use since many years, or probably decades.
And just a question common to all, so especially as far as the retinoblastoma management is concerned, what changes have you seen in the COVID situation? I mean, have you made any changes whatsoever to your retinoblastoma follow-ups, to your retinoblastoma treatments? Are you deferring some cases? Or,
Yes,
that
thank you for that question. Actually, I was hoping to talk on this too. So, COVID-19 has brought an unprecedented sequence of events upon us. So, the lockdown certainly made for some challenges. A few of the patients from little away or remote areas from Pune were not able to travel on their given dates. However, so retinoblastoma is or any cancer for that matter, is its own kind of emergency. A couple of a few days or a week of a delay might not result in catastrophic events. So we try to keep the follow-ups as timely as possible. What I am doing what we are doing at HB Desai Eye Hospital
नाही
is
लीव्ह
trying
करायचं
to
कुठे आहे माहितीये तुला
trying
मीटिंग
to
लीव्ह करायचं
continue the EUAs for children who are under active focal treatment. For example, children who need active intravitreal chemotherapies or lasers or thermotherapy. For the children who have been stable for last 2 or 3 follow-ups, we are trying to examine them under restraint and image them with the help of a RETCam, so that we get an overview and check for any recurrences or new tumors in such eyes. So certainly COVID has brought upon new challenges, but with the new modified protocols and with all with due precautions, we are continuing the treatment of retinoblastoma children. Those who need active therapy are being examined as well as being treated. Tushar sir, would you like to comment upon increased, probably the amount of risk these children have regarding COVID-19, because they inherently will have immunocompromised state, whoever is under active chemotherapy now and just recently. So do you want to enlighten about that?
So one or two things that in general, the tolerance to chemotherapy of child or children is much better than adults. So these kind of cytopenias that happen, and the percentage of cytopenias are much lesser in children. They have got a very good hematopoietic reserve, unless they have been subjected to multiple lines of chemotherapy and radiation. So that's one thing. And second is that even if you take COVID as such, with in non-oncology perspective, the morbidity and mortality in children has been very less. So unless there is a strong history that this patient has landed up into severe neutropenia and complications related to neutropenia, we are not really worried about the child. If the child chemotherapy has to take place, we are not delaying it. We're doing it the scheduled time.
And Dr. Nikhil, any other questions for the panelists, please?
I have one question. Can I ask one question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So whoever is, I would just wanted to ask that, is there any analysis done as far as long-term side effects of retinoblastoma treatment have been done for these patients, be it surgery, be it radiation, be it chemotherapy? Is there any analysis of this data available? I'm not aware because I've not read much into those details.
They do have 5-year and 10-year survival rates by a larger group, but mostly in the Western population. In Indian scenario, I think AIMS has published a study for their 5-year, am I right, Dr. Murthy? Their 5-year survival rates. And all of them have shown good response for group A to C or D tumors. The clinch is in group E as well as orbital retinoblastoma. Unfortunately, 40% of children presented to us belong to the advanced category, that is group E and henceforward, or orbital retinoblastoma. So that is where we differ in numbers from the Western literature.
Even toxicity, I'm worried about the long-term toxicities happening. Right. So I want to know if there is any data available as regards that.
The Western population does carry the fertility, the effects on fertility, as well as acumen and cognitive functions development. But we would like to carry that out, mirror the study in our population as the children we treat grow up.
Yeah, so I wanted to point out this because definitely survival is now probably not a big question in terms of for retinoblastoma. It so happened that in acute leukemias, way back 50 years or 60 years back when they started, they had 80% mortality. Then last 20 years, the mortality dropped down to only 20%, 80% cure rates. Last 10 years, we've been having in acute lymphoblastic leukemia 95 to 98% cure rates, and we've had our what we say as total focus, not on survival now, but long-term toxicities. So it was now the protocols which were devised 5 years back are getting modified and redefined every 6 months so that the long-term side effects can be decreased. So survival is now much better, and now we are concentrating or focusing more on the toxicity aspect.
We used to have a lot of problems when we used the external beam radiotherapy, a lot of second non-ocular malignancies. But with chemotherapy, there's no such kind of indication. There's a lot of problems. It seems to be very safe and effective.
Okay.
Dr. Nikhil, any questions?
He's muted, I think.
Yeah, so I guess we had a wonderful session today. All the speakers, Dr. Sonal, Dr. Ramesh, Dr. Tushar Patil, I thank you all. Thank Dr. Nikhil for moderating the session. And we had actually a very good attendance. When we see the other webinars that we have done, for this particular webinar, we had highest attendance. And I'm very, very thankful to all of you. You could make time. And it's more important is that we were able to create an awareness. Now, even I'm an anterior segment surgeon. We didn't have much of a knowledge that we have this genetic counseling centers. Where are they available in Pune, or what are the treatment modalities available with us in Pune itself? So it definitely helps us, and I'm sure it will help many who are attending this. I'll also be sharing this particular session on YouTube and Facebook very soon. Also, I request Dr. Sonal to, once the session is over, to share the video she had made an awareness video on retinoblastoma, to share it with the Pune Ophthalmic Society, and I'll also share it on the various group of the Facebook and the POS YouTube video as well. You have made a wonderful video, and we'll share it with everyone once the meet is over. And with this, Gitanjali ma'am, would you like to add some closing remarks, please?
Yeah. I thank you all the speakers, Dr. Tushar, Dr. Sonal, Dr. Ramesh. I also thank Dr. Nikhil for moderating the session, and I also thank all the delegates because there was an excellent interactive session. Special thanks to Dr. Vrishali for bringing out many questions, so that made it more interesting, and we got a lot of more information today. Thank you all, and that's all for today. So Sonal, please share that video what Dr. Mukesh has requested you.
Yes, ma'am. Sure. Thank you so much.
Be very
Thank you so much.
For having us.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Stay safe. Thank you.